welcome to the outlet. This is episode 10, and today we are discussing thimerosal. I'm Mac.
I'm Drew.
All right, so first of all, what is thimerosal and why are we discussing it? Thimerosal is a mercury-containing preservative commonly used in things like vaccines and tattoo ink, that kind of stuff.
Cosmetics. Skin liners.
And why is it important? Well, turns out that mercury is one of the most neurotoxic substances known to man, and that has been well established throughout the years. And the main chemical that we talk about with mercury poisoning is methyl mercury, and thimerosal is slightly different, as it is ethyl mercury. Methyl and ethyl mercury are not the same, but they are very similar. And this thimerosal is very important because it's in vaccines, and it was given to a large portion of the pretty much all the populace of the United States, and specifically to infants. And around 2000, a bunch of medical doctors got together and petitioned for it to be removed from children's vaccines, which today it is allegedly mostly removed from children's vaccines, even though we're not sure on that because the CDC does not require vaccine manufacturers to release everything in their vaccines. At least usually they have a list of ingredients, but they do not show amounts. That's per the CDC's website. And that would be concerning when something like mercury is in a vaccine, because mercury is neurotoxic at extremely low doses. I think the EPA's safe dose per day is about 0.1 micrograms. Is it per
two parts per billion?
2 parts per billion
is the EPA standard for the maximum amount allowable in drinking water. And only up to 200 parts per billion is considered hazardous waste. Not hazardous to a human body, but hazardous waste.
Wow.
And thimerosal is a 50% solution of 50,000 parts per billion ethyl mercury.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So, give you an idea of how toxic it really is. It's insane.
The current medical literature states that thimerosal is totally, completely, 100% safe, and their studies are based on what we would call faulty data, because they're based on a large portion of the population who may or may not have been exposed to thimerosal, and their indicator of exposure is autism, which autism diagnosis has changed drastically throughout the years. We've seen a extremely large increase in the cases of autism, and that has many factors based on how we are diagnosing it, what is considered autism, what isn't, but it does appear to be greatly on the rise regardless of how you diagnose it. And looking into the history of autism, sometime around the turn of the century, I think, is when the term was kind of coined, and from there it's kind of spiraled into this big thing that includes all sorts of neurological disorders, usually for kids, child autism. And
so the first place to look in setting this whole thing, as a skeptic or whatever you believe, the first place to look is, okay, let's set my bias aside. Let's see the studies that have been done. Let's see what kind of tests have been done with thimerosal on human beings. Well, this is when you start to go down the rabbit hole, because there has been one study on human beings amid all the controversy of thimerosal throughout the past 40 or 50 years, and this one test was done in 1929 on 27 terminal meningitis patients. They were each one of them was given a 1% solution of thimerosal, which is much, much more than what's contained in the vaccines. But either way, 1% solution, which was killing animals in a laboratory. Every single person died of meningitis. They were already terminal before they were given these thimerosal injections.
And they said, oh, they just died of meningitis. Well,
but yeah, exactly. But Eli Lilly, concluded that there was no harm from the thimerosal because they died of
Interesting.
meningitis.
And it was the producer of thimerosal claiming that there
Yes.
was no harm.
Yes, Eli
No
Lilly. Yeah, we
bias there when
investigated ourselves and found that we've done nothing wrong.
Yeah, just crazy. So, someone who's kind of a skeptic would look at this and say, okay, it's been well established over the years that mercury is horribly neurotoxic, even at extremely low doses. So why the hell are we using it as a preservative in a vaccine? And it turns out, well, thimerosal is cheap, but it's not a very great preservative and may not be very effective at all, according to some of the congressional testimony. So again, we ask, well, why the hell was it in there in the first place? Why would you risk something as dangerous as mercury? Well, then, okay, the CDC says this version of mercury is safe. Okay, so why would ethyl mercury be safe and methyl mercury be really dangerous? Yes, they're very different chemical compounds, but we need some evidence here that ethyl mercury doesn't damage your brain. And if you look at the literature, the toxicology of ethyl mercury, well, there aren't a whole lot of studies done on it. The EPA considers ethyl and methyl mercury to be the same. And the argument the CDC gives us for ethyl mercury being safe is that it clears your body quicker than methyl mercury. Well, it turns out it's not that much quicker, and that's only looking at your blood. It doesn't look at your brain. And plenty of evidence suggests that methyl mercury and ethyl mercury can both cross the blood-brain barrier, and there may be a dangerous synergistic effect between the two. And there is not a whole lot of difference between how they stay in the brain, because it looks like both methyl mercury and ethyl mercury can stay in the brain. Some of the ethyl mercury can be converted to the inorganic form, methyl mercury, and stay in the brain and cause damage. And the argument the CDC gives is, oh, well, it gets out of your body quickly. And they don't even look at what its effect is on the brain.
And the other place that ethyl mercury collects, so they don't check, is the womb. And that is where it collects mostly in women, along with the brain. So here you have a situation where women are getting vaccines or encouraged to get vaccines while they're pregnant. The mercury is collecting in the womb, surrounding the baby with mercury. And then babies get vaccines at younger and younger ages at higher frequencies with more thimerosal in the vaccines.
And that's relevant because the flu vaccine still contains thimerosal. And is there another one that pregnant women get that contains thimerosal? There may be.
The three I found were flu, tetanus, and H1N1.
Okay.
They're reported to containing thimerosal.
In most cases, the woman is probably only exposed to flu vaccine. But throughout the 90s, there was a very large amount of thimerosal used in most of the children's vaccines. And
yes.
And, so the next question we would ask is, well, okay, I think we've well established that ethyl mercury is also neurotoxic and dangerous to the brain. So in what dose is it dangerous? Is it similar to methyl mercury? The studies would suggest yes, it's similar. It's not safe at significantly higher doses. And well, then we'd ask, well, how much ethyl mercury is contained in the thimerosal, and how much thimerosal is in a vaccine? So how much is a child exposed to? Let's look at the children from the 90s when there still was thimerosal in all the children's vaccines.
You have the graph in front of you.
So it looks like in a single vaccination day, and a typical dose of ethyl mercury would be about 3 to 18 micrograms per kilogram body weight. Now that is an alarming dose because the EPA's recommendation is only 0.1 micrograms per kilogram per day of that'd be methyl mercury. So we're greatly exceeding that dose by more than an order of magnitude, almost a little over one order of magnitude. And an infant's brain is developing. That'd be this is an extremely important time in
its most susceptible state.
Yes. So I think that definitely establishes that there's danger with injecting ethyl mercury into the body. So that now I think the next question would be, well, why are there recent studies done suggesting that thimerosal is totally safe in children's vaccines? And I would suggest that either the studies are flawed or what they're looking for just isn't apparent because there's so much other mercury
Right.
Exposure.
One of the thoughts I had was, okay, so this thimerosal is obviously controversial. It's a preservative. It's possibly making people sick or causing mental disorder. It must be a really important, necessary ingredient to these vaccines, right? It must be really important if they're willing to give us vaccines with the risk of these conditions coming to fruition. It must be important. It must be vital.
And the congressional testimony says
wrong.
No,
yeah, the FDA even admitted they only use thimerosal so that they can store the vaccines in larger numbers. They do not need to have thimerosal in the vaccines at all if they store the vaccine doses in single doses, which is totally feasible. And the FDA admits it's totally feasible. It just costs more money. So it's not only a cheaper way to roll out all these vaccines, but you have Eli Lilly creating thimerosal and the vaccine itself. So the drug company is making more money off of basically smaller boxes, shipping less and making more.
Yeah. And some of the most recent studies, actually most of them have direct ties to the CDC, and they were the ones reviewing the cases and maybe even conducting the studies.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's alarming because if the CDC did find guilt, it would they'd probably be like perjuring themselves because they've allowed these vaccines to be used for 100 years now. I actually don't know how long the CDC has been around, but they could get in massive trouble, and they seem to be very concerned with if they released information that thimerosal was dangerous, that people would stop getting vaccines. And that's a big motivator for them to cover up the potential links to autism. And there's actually a whistleblower within the CDC, I believe his name is William Thompson. He's a PhD researcher who has come out and said, my boss at the CDC asked me to lie in relation to the case of thimerosal and vaccines and the links to autism. And that's very alarming.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I came across that through Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s page, where he's crusading to have a closer look at mercury in vaccines taken by the CDC. And he has a lot of good information there.
Definitely. The most damning case, well, the vaccine controversy, especially the thimerosal controversy, is nothing new. In 1948, the AMA created a committee to investigate the negative aspects of this mercury containing thimerosal because there's so many complaints about the vaccines back then. That was over 60 years ago.
Yeah.
And then in the 90s, what a lot of people don't remember is there was a case that Eli Lilly actually had to settle. They actually had to admit that their vaccine actually probably gave this girl autism, Hannah Poling. The only reason that the litigation got to the level it did was because her father was a neurologist and he understood exactly what was going on, what was in the vaccine. He had the gall and the persistence to take it all the way to the top. Otherwise, many people have gone through the same. In 2002, there were 45 different lawsuits against Eli Lilly as of 2002 about vaccines, only about vaccines. And Eli Lilly is a company that's, they're responsible for Prozac, Cymbalta, and the largest, like you said, the largest fine ever, the largest settlement ever in any court or not court, maybe it was court case, but at least a pharmaceutical case, Zyprexa.
Yeah, over a $1 billion settlement.
Yeah, I mean, so this is the nature of the company that's creating the thimerosal and telling you, it's safe, it's fine. But some of the studies, like the George Lucier document Lucier document we were reading, was hypothesizing that that thimerosal actually kills cells by poisoning their mitochondria. And this Hannah Poling girl who won the case against Eli Lilly prior to receiving a large string of vaccines already had aggravated mitochondrial disease. So her father being a neurologist, putting these two together was successful in bringing it to Lilly's case. But since they settled, one of the caveats of settling the case was they had the case sealed. And no one would have really known about it if it weren't for the Poling family coming around and actually going on national television and talking to newspapers and stuff, actually talking to people about it. But you don't hear about that very often. You kind of have to dig for that a little bit.
Yep. So I have the Lussier paper pulled up in which he offers many, many great sources, which I've actually gone through and looked at most of these sources that he's published. But he's actually saying that inorganic mercury doesn't pass the blood-brain barrier as easily as other types of mercury, but once an organic mercury gets into the brain, can be converted back into inorganic mercury, which was the dangerous substance that the FDA and CDC was warning about. So the idea that ethyl mercury passes your body quickly does not hold weight there. There's plenty of studies suggesting that. And he's predicting that the health risk from thimerosal exposure, he's looking at a 6-fold variation in blood and brain half-life. So he's actually saying that organic mercury may stay in your brain actually longer.
Of course.
So there's the opposite of what the CDC is trying to skew you falsely to believe. There's multiple studies suggesting that vaccines greatly exceed safe levels of mercury, and these are being injected into the bloodstream of infants. And they basically don't even look at ethyl mercury specifically, but then they state, oh, it's different. It's different than methyl mercury. And Lussier says that on vaccination day, a 2-month-old infant receives 3 to 18 micrograms per kilogram body weight of ethyl mercury, which exceeds EPA reference dose by 30 to 180 times. Now tell me how that isn't a danger to your brain.
No kidding.
And that's
I want to read this real quick. This little paragraph. This is the George W. Lussier paper. He's a toxicologist who worked directly for the FDA and the CDC for over 20 years. And this is his paper he did on thimerosal. And this is the little tiny paragraph called Summary of the Report on thimerosal. This is his paper. The vaccine preservative thimerosal contains 50% ethyl mercury. Its structural analog, methyl mercury, is a potent and well-known developmental neurotoxin, and substantial evidence exists that ethyl mercury is also a developmental neurotoxin. Based on studies that mercury reaches the brain after thimerosal or ethyl mercury exposure, the knowledge that the amount of ethyl mercury in vaccines exceeds safe levels and the results from a number of health effects and mechanism studies, it is highly probable that the use of thimerosal as a preservative has caused developmental disorders, including autism in some children. That's the most damning part, I think, of that entire. That's the whole summary of the paper. Is that okay? You can whine and complain about the differences of ethyl and methyl mercury all day long. They're both mercury, and there's no evidence saying one is less dangerous than the other, really. There's evidence both ways. They both contain mercury. They're both neurotoxins.
Yep. The common mainstream thinking is that all the literature says it's safe. All the literature says it's safe. Well, that's just totally, completely false. Because until about 1999 or 2000, pretty much all the literature said thimerosal is dangerous. And the CDC, etc., totally ignored that. All the vaccine companies totally ignored that and actually added more and more mercury. And autism, while there's not an accepted single cause, mercury poisoning has been strongly linked to autism. So plenty of evidence here that thimerosal is just awful and should not be in vaccines. That's obviously the conservative way of thinking, is to say, we know mercury is really dangerous. Let's use a different preservative that doesn't have mercury in it to preserve our vaccines, especially the ones being injected into children. Like, how could that not be the approach a scientist would take? How can the vaccine companies and the CDC allow such a thing to happen? This points to a huge conspiracy here.
Exactly. And that question has already been answered that you just asked. Let's use a different preservative. Do we need to use preservatives? The answer is no, we don't. We don't have to use preservatives in vaccines if we store them in single-use vials. So the question's already been answered.
Yeah, I think that means we can speculate on the motives here, and you can look into business interests. And sure, Eli Lilly was the one producing thimerosal. They could probably charge more for it. I think they were the one producing it, right?
Yes.
So that's a pretty small motive, because they're already getting paid for the vaccine anyway. But that leads me to wonder if there was actually someone high up who said, let's dumb down the population by putting mercury in the vaccine. Like, why else would somebody suggest such a thing?
I don't know.
Crazy.
We can speculate all day long, but and we even both kind of hesitated to do this video a little bit, but it received such emotional responses from everybody. Anytime you talk about vaccines, you polarize people so much, and the fact that people get so emotional about even just someone like you or me bringing up the idea that vaccines could be harmful or that thimerosal is a neurotoxin, the fact that elicits an emotional response means that it needs further discussion or further investigation by anybody, really. Yeah. And you have more of a background on this, but I would say that I've pretty much gained all of my knowledge in the past 24 hours on this subject.
Yeah.
Very, very easy stuff to find. So the information's out there. So the question, really is why? Why is this still an issue? Why is there thimerosal in vaccines when it's shown we don't even need preservatives? And there are studies that show that thimerosal doesn't even work as a preservative, to go take it even another step farther. So where is the real motive?
Right.
And I would say you need only ask the question, cui bono, who benefits? Who's making thimerosal? Who's making money from putting this in vaccines? Oh, wait, it's the same company that's making vaccines? Wow, that's not a conflict of interest, is it? I mean, we'll talk about a glaring. I mean, that's so obvious. I mean, that's where you look right there. Look at the companies. Eli Lilly. Look no further. And Eli Lilly has been caught and sued hundreds and hundreds of times for their own drugs causing unknown side effects. Come on, guys. The light is shining on the core of the issue, but everybody has really dark sunglasses on, I guess, because no one really wants to look, including the AMA, FDA, CDC. Everybody's willfully ignorant. It makes you think, what kind of power does a company like Eli Lilly have? That's the first question I'd ask. After,
and who's controlling the company? Who's
controlling the company?
I want to know who's on their board and who's directing this company, because looking back at the history of Eli Lilly, the man Eli Lilly founded the company in the 1800s, and by all accounts, he seemed like he was a very smart chemist, pharmacist, and it looked like he did a very good job of establishing his business. And at the time, there were no patent medications, and he looked like he just did a really good job at what he was doing, and didn't look like there were any evil motives, period. But I'm not sure when he passed away, but I mean, I imagine it was a little after the turn of the century, and that's when this whole thimerosal thing came to be. What were we finding? Maybe the 1920s, 1930s?
Yeah, so 1929 was when that thimerosal study was done on the meningitis patients.
I don't even know if I think his son may have had something to do with the company, but at what point did they sell to the point where somebody else took this company over? Somebody else was guiding this company, and it was not the same company, ethical company that seems to be founded by Eli Lilly himself. So that would be another interesting topic of research to find out.
Definitely.
Who was marketing this. And now we're to the point now where, imagine if this information did get out, if everybody did say look into the information and say, wow, thimerosal is neurotoxic, we should not be putting this in vaccines, period, whether it's infants or for adults. Who who goes to jail? Who gets the whole CDC is uncovered as a fraud agency basically.
Mhm.
They're a total fraud if you believe that thimerosal is dangerous and they allowed it for 100 years to be put in children's vaccines period.
Exactly. Well, the FDA is right there with them because the FDA is
Yeah.
supposed to control the toxicity, and the CDC is supposed to be the one demanding which vaccines are needed, and also performing quality control, make sure
Yeah.
that the vaccines are safe too. So,
But if you do accept that there's this much fraud occurring between big pharma, the FDA, and the CDC, where else is it occurring across the medical community? Probably all over. And this would be send such shockwaves through the system that people just couldn't take it. This would challenge so many of our dogmatic beliefs as a society.
yeah, the CDC, the FDA, um, the manufacturers of the vaccines and thimerosal, and the doctors themselves are culpable. Now, I say the doctors themselves with a big grain of salt because there are most of the doctors that will administer a vaccine work for a not-for-profit hospital,
Yeah.
and their practices have more than likely been bought out by a hospital administrator who is their employer. The doctors no longer work for themselves, mostly. They
Right.
work for a hospital or hospital administrator. So the doctors aren't visited anymore by Merck and Eli Lilly. The hospital administrators go visit, and then they order the doctors what to do. So some of these doctors might be totally ignorant of what's going on, which is on them totally. But that
It
also
is.
opens
Yeah.
the door very easily for some willfully ignorant family practitioner or whoever to suggest and administer
I mean,
vaccines
I
like
think I
this.
think what we're getting at here is there's a danger to these hierarchical systems where you have full belief in those above you, and
Mhm.
you look at most of these doctors we're talking about are great, smart, honest people who want to help you, who want to keep you healthy. They're not trying to you know steal more money from you in their practice. They're not trying to keep you sick. But somewhere up the chain, somebody is obviously trying to do just that. And like
Mhm.
you're saying, we need doctors to look into this. And that is actually what happened with the case of thimerosal. A bunch of doctors did say, "Hey, wait a second, we don't want mercury going into getting injected into infant's body, even if it is a small amount." Even though they didn't, I mean, they didn't even know the amount. But by the mainstream, they've been barbecued lately for saying even though there was no evidence that thimerosal was bad, the doctors had it. They wanted it removed from vaccines. No evidence? There's hundreds of years of evidence.
There's been evidence since its creation.
Yeah, so there's some research out there who think the tremendous rise in autism was directly responsible from the use of
Yeah,
thimerosal and other
they,
mercury containing
they hesitated to
products.
originally test this on human beings because it was killing dogs.
Yeah,
I mean, come on. In
it's
the late
it's
20s, early
crazy what
30s.
it's crazy what we accept as truth and that what we don't go investigate ourselves.
The point of this video, I think, is that we both rebuffed our knowledge a lot by doing very little investigating. I mean, we both like doing it in our spare time. That's why we do the videos. But it did not take much digging for us to dig any of this information up. So go
Yeah,
look into it first. If you feel, if you get emotional about these topics, then even more reason to go educate yourself and confront those ideas. Why do I get emotional about this? Is it because I don't know really what's going on, or because it's my I don't want to shatter my own worldview, thinking that vaccines could be bad and that there could be some malicious intent somewhere down the line. So it doesn't take much digging into this to figure out what's really going on, and that there is some malicious intent
yeah, and at
somewhere.
the top of the pyramid, you have these media overlords telling us that if you question vaccines, you're an anti-vaxxer, you're anti-science, you don't believe in evolution, you believe the Earth is flat,
Mm-hmm.
climate change denier, you're all the same, you're all
Yeah,
anti-science,
you
you're
probably have pictures of
unscientific.
Bigfoot. You probably have pictures of Bigfoot and
It's
aliens.
it's pretty scientific to go look back at the data for the last 100 years and look into something as neurotoxic as mercury. And I think we have a totally legitimate scientific case here. And I think many, many other researchers have come to the same conclusion, which is the only reason we're talking about this, because we read their work.
Yes. Well, the thimerosal subject is extremely interesting, but through studying that, the thing that piques my interest more now, which we'll have to do another video on, is Eli Lilly.
Yeah.
We need to do a video on that company, because when we start to dig into that at all, I have a feeling it's going to become even more clear that it's.
I think their current market value is somewhere around $100 billion if someone wanted to buy them, which I don't know what that ranks them, but that puts them pretty big in the world as far as pharmaceutical companies go. There may be a few bigger than them, and they're probably in some kind of collusion with those other big companies.
More than likely.
Okay, well, I think that will do it for this episode.
More to come soon.
Yeah. Signing off.